Hi, sweeties. How are you doing? Welcome to Nialism. Thank you so much for the support. Hope you all are doing great. So, I came across a video of a young Native American woman talking about black people, and then she ended up calling black people settler, right? And it did not go well with me. Why? Because how can you call black people settlers? Black people are not settlers. Black people were kidnapped from their home countries, right? And were brought over to United States of America. So if you call black people settlers, what are you going to call Europeans? Right? Now I am going to say this. Why is it that everybody wants to have opinion when it comes to black people? Because last I checked, black people are Americans, right? And the best they are doing is that the best they did was to create their own culture in a very beautiful way. And also living their own life. So how come all of a sudden they became settlers? But then I am going to tell this woman, it looks like she doesn't also know that she came from Africa. Because all humans on earth came from Africa. I don't know why some people are avoiding this particular one, but you know what?
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually somewhat predicted in this article I read a while back. One part of the article claims that there are differences between being oppressed and being a settler. If people are unable to distinguish between the two, then they risk perpetuating the very colonial dynamics they claim to resist. Overall, I guess that this video won't just be encompassing Black Americans, but also other settler immigrants, in hopes that they can, in more detail, understand these dynamics and be able to not repeat these cycles of oppression and control. Black Americans are just the most prominent example I see happening currently. So, this article describes a settler move to innocence called colonial equivocation. To elaborate on this, I quickly want to read you guys this quote. Describing all struggles against imperialism as decolonizing creates a convenient ambiguity between decolonization and social justice work, especially among people of color, queer people, and other groups minoritized by the settler nation state. We are all colonized may be a true statement, but is deceptively abrasive and vague. Its inference is that none of us are settlers. End quote. This derives from the article Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, written by Eva Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, and that quote can be found on page 17. It is a fact that we are all affected by colonization, but by saying that we are all colonized, the implication is that no one is a settler, which can ignore the fact that some people of color can still be settlers on indigenous land that was taken from us. In movements where people of marginalized groups can come together to fight shared forms of oppression, there is a real temptation to emphasize unity over difference. Now, when addressing these issues, these individuals need to move with caution, because if coalition spaces don't make space for indigenous sovereignty and don't recognize the difference between being oppressed and being a settler, then they risk reproducing the same colonial dynamics they claim to oppose. Now, this is where I see the issue around Black Americans identifying as Native American begin to arise. Look, I'm not trying to divide or cancel each other. I'm simply trying to highlight the importance of being more precise, accountable, and just in how we understand and resist systems of power. Now, first, we need to look at why people claim Indigenous identity to begin with. There are numerous reasons as to why people pretend or want to identify as Indigenous. False claims of indigeneity can be used to gain access to career and academic funds, or to access the minimal financial gains Indigenous communities are compensated for decades of resource extraction of our territories. Some individuals may want the social clout of being Indigenous. Another reason for identifying as Indigenous is incorrect family lore. This could be in the form of stories passed down from a grandparent, telling tales of a distant Indigenous ancestor. You know, the old claim of my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess kind of thing. But I think the most prevalent reason for wanting to identify as Indigenous comes from the writings of Philip J. Deloriez in their 1998's Playing Indian. Now, to quote, "Americans wanted to feel a natural affinity with the continent," end quote. In other words, there is a settler anxiety of not belonging. So in essence, they want to feel a part of something, whether a family or a culture that is directly connected to this land. Now, on a side note, we could say with this logic, people who are against immigration don't have any real stance, as many people's ancestors came here illegally at some point and don't belong here. And it's interesting how they're scared the way that immigrants will treat them is the exact way that colonial settlers treated Indigenous peoples when they came here. They raped and assaulted and genocided our people, and now they're scared that immigrants are just criminals and blah, blah, blah. But I can make a whole video around that another time. Anyways, settlers are not just Caucasian Americans. With this understanding, there are a few complexities to address. The United States is a settler colonial nation state that also operates as an empire by utilizing external and internal forms of colonization simultaneous to the settler colonial project. This means that dispossessed people are brought onto seized Indigenous land through other colonial projects, such as military recruitment, often from poor or racialized communities such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines, labor migration, such as bringing in low-wage farm workers, or high-skilled workers such as bringing in engineers from India or the Philippines. There is displacement due to war economic policies, for instance, the millions of refugees from countries impacted by US wars or neoliberal trade deals. And there's the most notable one we're kind of highlighting in this video, which is enslavement, as in the forced migration and labor of African people. Now, to quote, "In this sense, settlers are diverse, not just of white European descent, but include people of color, even from other colonial contexts," end quote. Page 7 can be found in that article. So, while these individuals didn't directly take the land, they still benefit from and participate in the settler colonial structure, just differently than white tea settlers. To kind of give an example, let's say an immigrant from a formerly colonized country settles in Canada. They may face racism and discrimination, but they also live on Indigenous land and benefit from the infrastructure and systems that were built through colonization. If they participate in land ownership, state governance, or simply benefit from services like healthcare and education without recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, they are participating in and benefiting from settler colonialism. This doesn't mean that they are bad people, but it does mean that they are not outside of or innocent in these systems. Settler colonialism in the US doesn't only involve white tea Europeans. It includes many racial and ethnic groups because the structure itself is about occupation and control of Indigenous land, not just race. People of color can be both oppressed and settlers at the same time, depending on the context. With all of this, solidarity becomes complex. This challenges us to rethink what true decolonization and solidarity looks like. It's not just about racial justice or economic justice, but land justice and Indigenous sovereignty. How do people who are themselves displaced or oppressed stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples whose land they now occupy? If we don't address these complexities honestly, or if we fail in confronting what responsibility comes with those who now settle to the Americas specifically, then those very people who are affected by colonialism also risk perpetuating the same harmful systems they claim to oppose. In this, we need to recognize three things to make sure that we don't repeat these cycles. First, the complexity of power and position, including how one can be both oppressed and complicit. Recognize that not all forms of colonialism are the same and that settler colonialism is still ongoing, and be able to center Indigenous struggles and sovereignty, not sidelight them with vague universal language like we're all colonized. When people of color immigrate into the US or Canada, they aren't just newcomers who are entering a country, but more specifically, they're entering a settler colonial system where they are placed into pre-existing structures of power based on race, land, and labor. For instance, when you are entering these countries, you're either encouraged to assimilate and become a settler by buying land, investing in whiteness, adopting settler norms, or you are marked as a criminal, disposable, or unassimilable. For example, if you don't assimilate into these white norms, into whiteness, you are now seen as illegal, as threats, or as permanent outsiders, kind of thing. These pre-existing structures can be known as the settler, native, and slave, and immigrants or newcomers are slotted into them in complicated and contradictory ways. Look, colonialism is no longer distinct, but is now blending into new and complex forms. In this, we can explore a term also coined in the article called shuffling between categories, which means settler colonialism doesn't treat these categories as fixed. It moves people around in ways that serve its power. To kind of explain in more detail, this article gives an example on page 18, the Aleut people. And I am so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. They are a native group who were originally seen as indigenous to the Aleutian Islands, but during World War II, they were suddenly treated more like the Orientalized others, suspected of being loyal to Japan, racialized as potentially dangerous or indistinguishable from the enemy. At the same time, their forced relocation and the horrific camp conditions caused death and illness, resembling the treatment of the enslavable other, being treated as bodies to be moved, controlled, and neglected without consequence. Now, why does this matter? Because it shows that settler colonialism isn't rigid, it's strategically flexible. It reassigns racial meanings and political status to different groups depending on what protects or extends settler power. The Aleut indigenous people can be temporarily racialized as foreign enemies or labor bodies to justify removal or neglect, even while they remain indigenous. The triad, settler, native, slave, isn't just a descriptive model, it's an active mechanism of control, adaptable to new situations like war, migration, or economic shifts. The shuffling isn't about how the state reclassifies people for convenience and control. What Black Americans claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually somewhat predicted in this article I read a while back.
Well, hello there. Guess what you can't claim? To be the original inhabitant of the world. How about that? We don't have to claim a land mass. We were here first. How about that? Be encouraged, my brothers and sisters. You don't have to claim individual land masses. You can claim the entire earth. We are indigenous to the earth. How about that? You like that? And unlike you, we don't share common ancestors with the rest of the world. And by ancestors, I mean Neanderthals and Denisovans. We're 100% Homo sapien, homegrown. So have fun with the landmass of America. I could care the fuck less. 10 out of fucking 10.
Black people truly have no allies, and solidarity is really out the window in my mind for everyone under the POC umbrella. But especially when it comes to Black people, it appears that we are just the can everybody wants to kick around. A Native woman came online and said that Black people are settlers. We are the settlers under the settler colonialism.
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually somewhat predicted in this article. There are differences between being oppressed and being a settler. If people are unable to distinguish between the two, then they think Black Americans, but also other settler immigrants. It is a fact that we are all affected by colonization, but by saying that we are all colonized, the implication is that no one is a settler, which can ignore the fact that some people of color can still be settlers on indigenous land.
You may be thinking to yourself, how does that make any sense? Because a Native definitely knows that African Americans are a product of enslaved people. But she's tying it to all those pretendians who saying that they're the original inhabitants of this land. They're the original Indians. They're the natives of this land, even though that's not all of us. So to take a claim that's made by a small percentage of Black people in this country and then say that all Black people are settlers is really crazy. Settler colonialism is a logic and structure using colonial rule to overtake an environment and replace it with your own people and replace the indigenous people, which has happened here. Black people did not settle in America by choice. Anybody that has settled around the world under the imperialistic guise that happened during the Great Scramble for Africa, for China, India, Australia, and Americas, that was Europeans. We did not settle here. We were forced here by slavery, a system of slavery, one of the biggest migration of human bodies in human history. And we then spent hundreds of years here under forced labor, while at the same time, I can hold two truths. At the same time, your ancestors were killed, were taken out by biological warfare, your land was stolen, there were land grabs, you were forced into settlements, you were forced into containment areas. That is true, but we didn't do that. We didn't take your land over. If anything, the Malian kingdom definitely visited America hundreds of years before Europe. Scandinavians visited the America hundreds of years before Columbus. But the French, the Dutch, the English, they stayed. The Spanish, they stayed. This conversation is crazy. I feel like every day there's always something new that's coming up about Black Americans that people feel the need to use us to drive their point home. Two things can be true. This can be your land, you can be colonized, you can be displaced, and settlers took your land. I can be the product of colonialism by forced migration and slavery. Wow. Because the pretendians are coming online saying that they're the natives, you're saying that we all are settlers. I've heard it all. I've heard it all.
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually...
So as respectfully and as genuinely curious, I would like to know more about where African American people are, talking about being from like European, they were talking about being from China, they're talking about being from all over the place, which I'm not disregarding, but I would like to understand for myself where these sources are from. The artifacts have been found. Is that accurate? Are we talking about the same African American people? I do not know. I personally have not researched the African American culture as much as my own, because I do believe that understanding myself first and knowing where I come from and who my ancestors are is more important than understanding somebody else's, and being respectful. I need to be respectful of other people's people and place. So I first off, I would like to say that I am building my tree, family tree. I am starting so late because I was adopted into a white family, so I lost all connection of who I was. I'm very, I would say up to 5 years ago, I was a very lost person because I did not understand my history or my ancestors or where I came from. But now finding relatives and finding people connected to my family tree, and also being born in Bolivia, I'm proud to say that I am part of the Amara tribe. And they're not the most well-known group, but they have been denied recognition for many, many years, even by the people who conquered the area and so on and so forth to this day. So it's been a struggle for them, as I understand it. But I think, as I said before, finding your own identity, finding what you can be proud of, and finding who your true people are is important and imperative, so that way we can respect and acknowledge other people's cultures and their languages and their people and their ways of living, because that is ultimately the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I grew up in a house where there was multiple different types of individuals growing up, and I mean that I was adopted, so I had adopted brothers and sisters who were not blood related to me. But I'm genuinely curious to figure out where people are getting their sources from as to how African Americans were all over the place. Now, some African Americans believe and deny deny the fact that they were not traveling up to a certain point within the 16 to the 1500s. I do believe that they were, but not to the proportion that the Europeans and the Spaniards were doing. At that point, they were involved with it at a larger and a larger percentage later on, as I understood and I have read. But at the same time, I mean, I'm talking about African Americans who claim to be traveling before that. So I would like to know more. So if all African American people can respond to this video, please watch the previous video before that. I don't acknowledge, how should I say this? I'm not from her indigenous or native. I do have native blood, 20% apparently. That's estimate, it's not exact. But I do have a native, I'm indigenous, no European, no Spanish, Spaniard blood in me thing. So I don't pretend to know all about them either. But I would like to acknowledge that her video, I do agree with the majority of it. Although I think some things could have been said a little bit differently. I think that we should respect ourselves, and when we find that we can respect ourselves, then we can respect others and see others for the beautiful people that they are. I do not have fully born or raised indigenous children because they are mixed. It is very hard to find Bolivian people in America. I have found that the group that I know, that I've become associated with and affiliated with online, there is Bolivian people in the United States, but they are very, 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 very few. Very, very few. I am the first generation in America, and I would like to know more.
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was
I agree with you that it's inherently wrong for Black Americans to mischaracterize our ethnogenesis in this country as indigeneity. I think it's inappropriate and disrespectful when Black people who are not Afro-Indigenous claim that they're Native American. And I know that Black Americans today do benefit from settler colonialism, thus making us complicit in the continued oppression of Indigenous people. I agree with your analysis on how people who experience oppression can also be oppressors. Where I feel like the argument kind of breaks down and you're getting pushback is that you don't really seem to have an understanding of the ethnogenesis of Black Americans. And also, describing us as settlers means that we had some kind of agency or choice or power in being here or being brought here, and we did it. I don't know that you could describe enslaved Africans who were brought here or their descendants as settler immigrants. We didn't choose to be here, and we ain't got nowhere to go to. You also brought up why someone would want to be considered Native, and you brought up, access to tribal resources, credibility, clout, if you will, or, it could even be a mistake that's rooted in misinformed family lore. I'm not dismissing that this stuff happens. I think that the relationship between Black Americans and Indigenous people is more complex than you're presenting. Let's start off talking about, allocation of resources. I'm sure you already know, but for the sake of people who don't know, tribal entities have government-to-government relationships with the United States, and a lot of that is rooted in Indian law. Tribes do have other economic investments that bring money into their community as well. And recognized members of this community are entitled to some of those funds, which is why it's important to be able to identify who's Native and who's not. And I understand that this is where that's coming. Because you can be a member of a tribe without being recognized as Indian by the U.S. government, or anti-miscegenation law that got carried over by the United States government. It determined that the child is indigenous if the mother is indigenous, as long as the father isn't white, then that child is white. If the mother is white and the father is indigenous, the child is indigenous. If the mother is Black and the father is indigenous, the child is Black. If the mother is indigenous and the father is Black, the child is Black. That was law code that people were adhering to until 2000. Ultimately, that was feeding into these blood quantum requirements. And I'm acknowledging that some tribes have adopted that out of necessity and that other tribes, it was imposed on them. And in addition to intermarriage, there's the possibility of adoption. Maybe you're a runaway slave who was formerly adopted by a tribe, to maintain your... There were also cases where Africans who were enslaved to tribal entities were able to purchase their freedom within that entity. We have a complex history of mutual exploitation, And now the power imbalance has shifted dramatically. Black people do have a lot more political power than indigenous people do right now in the United States. And that makes us complicit in this ongoing genocide and ethnocide. These mythologies that we keep constructing around being native is cultural erasure. And people have a right to be upset about that.
Being treated as bodies to be moved, controlled, and neglected without consequence. Now, why does this matter? Because it shows that settler colonialism isn't rigid, it's strategically flexible. It reassigns racial meanings and political status to different groups depending on what protects or extends settler power. The Aleut indigenous people can be temporarily racialized as foreign enemies or labor bodies to justify removal or neglect, even while they remain indigenous. The triad settler native slave isn't just a descriptive model, it's an active mechanism of control, adaptable to new situations like war, migration, or economic shifts. The shuffling isn't about how the state reclassifies people for convenience and control. The Aleut internment during World War II is one example of this. The US used Orientalist fear they might ally with Japan to justify the removal. They treated them with enslaving neglect, death and illness in camps, yet ignored their status as native peoples, whose sovereignty and rights should have protected them. This dynamic shows how settler colonialism is not just about land theft, it's also about constantly reshaping who counts as dangerous, disposable, assimilable, or valuable, depending on what protects the settler project. This, overall, explains a term also coined in the article called the colonizing trick. This is where groups of marginalized people have all been temporarily included or violently excluded depending on political needs. They temporarily elevate some racial or ethnic minorities by labeling them as model minorities or good immigrants, only to devalue and criminalize them during times of social or political crisis. A more modern example we can see this happening is with the Asian American individuals who were once excluded and violently targeted, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, but were then later celebrated as model minorities, but are still seen as foreign, especially in times like COVID-19 or geopolitical tensions. Groups of people are only granted limited inclusion into the settler state, depending on the labor they contribute. This false narrative says that as long as they assimilate, conform to norms of whiteness or respectability, and don't threaten the pre-existing racial or property order, if they follow all of these conditions, those individuals or groups may eventually own land, gain citizenship, and participate in settler society. This inclusion serves settler power by creating an illusion of progress or diversity while maintaining indigenous disposition and racial hierarchies. In essence, settler colonialism and capitalism don't treat workers as a single class. Instead, they sort workers into hierarchies based on race, immigration status, and perceived value. Some are rewarded with partial inclusion, while others are devalued, criminalized, and eliminated. The narrative tells them that if they work hard enough, they'll eventually be accepted as equals. But this is a false promise. No amount of labor or loyalty can undo the structural racism and colonial hierarchy that keeps them permanently trapped in second-class status. In this sense, it is important to deeply confront how colonial power structures divide and rank people based on race, labor, and proximity to land ownership. This ultimately highlights a strong critique on the myth of the democratic nation-state, a system based on equal rights, opportunity, and inclusion for all. But if some groups can never fully belong, even when they follow all the rules, then the nation isn't truly democratic. It's a racialized settler colonial project built on exclusion and hierarchy. So these minority experiences expose the limits and contradictions of that ideal. Becoming equal within a fundamentally unjust system doesn't challenge the system, it reinforces it. So if individuals can never become white, in other words, achieve full privilege and unmarked belonging, they can instead be offered a place at a lower tier participant in the settler colonial system. By participating in the economy, gaining citizenship, owning property, and benefiting, however unequally, from the continued occupation of indigenous land and suppression of indigenous sovereignty, they end up investing in the very system that colonizes. True solidarity and standing with indigenous means of decolonization requires going beyond representation or inclusion, but instead it means questioning the entire foundation of the settler state. Even people of color, though historically oppressed, can be recruited into settler roles, sometimes by pursuing equality within the system. So, I want to make it very clear that this is not meant to blame individuals, but to highlight the structural bind people of color are put in. Inclusion often requires alignment with the settler project, whether they want it to or not. So how can post-colonial resistance reproduce settler colonialism? When post-colonial migrants like Filipinos in the US or Canada seek stolen resources, they often do so by taking jobs in settler nations, buying homes on this land, benefiting from public goods funded by resource extraction. This becomes entangled with settler colonialism because the wealth they are reclaiming, education, land, wages, is often built on land that was first stolen from indigenous people. To reclaim it, they may unintentionally occupy and benefit from the very stolen land without dismantling settler structures. So, in short, you can't reclaim stolen resources without being on stolen land. Another side note to consider is how solidarity is often human-centered. It prioritizes human needs, wealth, and access. It is a fight that still sees land, water, animals, and air as resources to be used, rather than as relatives or living beings, a key value in many indigenous worldviews. So even after colonial rule ends, land and nature remain colonized. They don't get liberated, they remain exploited, they can't be post-colonial in the same way people can. This means that even empowered post-colonial subjects may still treat the land as a thing to be used, not a relative to be respected or returned to. A view that is often ignored when talking about standing in solidarity with indigenous peoples. So while post-colonial resistance, like migration to former colonial powers, may look like reclaiming justice, it often relies on and reinforces settler colonial structures, because the resources being reclaimed were first stolen from native land and people. And even well-meaning efforts of solidarity still remain human-centered, which ignores the land's ongoing colonization. True decolonization and standing in solidarity with one another would mean confronting this entanglement, not just reversing colonial relationships, but undoing the entire system of land theft, resource extraction, and settler entitlement. Equivocation means being vague or unclear, especially in a way that hides or avoids something important. In this case, the article is saying that some people talk about colonialism in vague or slippery ways that avoid talking about settler colonialism, which is a specific and ongoing form of colonization. Settler colonialism is when colonizers come to a land, take it over, and stay there permanently, like in the US or Canada or other countries. It isn't just about exploitation, it's about replacing indigenous people and claiming the land forever. Now, what's the problem here with the resource extraction and ignoring the colonization of indigenous lands? Because land is not just a backdrop, it's the basis of wealth, power, and law in settler states. If you talk about oppression or decolonization without addressing the land, you're not actually confronting settler colonialism. Some people of color are also settlers in indigenous lands, and we need to have an honest and uncomfortable conversation about that too. So in summary, equivocation is when people talk about colonialism or oppression in vague ways that avoid dealing with the foundational issue of stolen indigenous land and the power structures built on it. In Canada and the US, indigenous peoples are still actively resisting land theft, environmental destruction, broken treaties, and policies of erasure. Settler colonialism continues to shape everything from housing to policing to education. People must make space for conversations about indigenous sovereignty and decolonization. Without doing so, they risk reproducing the same colonial hierarchies and systems of oppression they claim to resist, systems that have also harmed them. We're seeing this now, for example, in cases where some African American individuals are claiming to be the original indigenous peoples of this land, which erases actual indigenous histories and continues colonial patterns of displacement and appropriation. So, that's all I got. Hi, could you explain how this is anti-Blackness? I'm genuinely curious. I'm not trying to come across as rude. I also have a few more questions. What do you think a claim to the land is? What do you think that looks like? So a lot of the people think that returning the land to Indigenous peoples means that we kick everyone off the land and we treat people the way that the colonizers has treated us. But in reality, when we look at the relationship between settlers and colonization, we understand, and the point that I was trying to make in the video, I'm sorry if this wasn't clear, is that the topic around settlers and the response and what it looks like to return sovereignty and stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples becomes very complex, as settlers aren't just Caucasian white settler descents. They're also people who were forcefully moved here against their will. They definitely, in my opinion, I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples, as we're not homogenous. All of us have our own opinions and our own ways of doing things. But in my belief, I don't think that they should be kicked out off of the land if they had their entire lives here. It's not their faults they wanted to be here in the first place. I think it's about returning sovereignty to the Indigenous peoples of these areas. We were promised within our treaties to hold the same legitimate power as those within a colonial system. And for many years, those treaties have not been honored and our opinions have been overlooked, our issues have been overlooked. But Indigenous peoples need to have their sovereignty returned. We need to be held with the same authority of that within colonial systems, because we have an innate connection to our geographical areas. Now, we have a history with these lands for over 10,000 years. We know how to live within well-being, as we understand the locality as the referent explained by Leroy Littlebear and J. Good Worldviews Colliding. We understand that each place requires its own set of conditions to live within well-being, as in something that works here isn't going to work down south. Something that works here isn't going to work up north. Something that works here isn't going to work in a rainforest. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And I don't really like the idea of hierarchies, like my people suffered more than yours, or yours did this. Like, I don't believe that I don't like to compare certain things, because we all have our own journeys. We all have our own experiences. As I like to say, the way Indigenous peoples looks at these systems as a whole, or the way that I like to look at these systems, is a word in our culture, in my people's community, the Okanagan people, chelt. Chelt means the brain can't work without the heart. The heart can't work without the lungs. The lungs can't work without the veins. Each part of the system works together so that we can live within well-being, kind of thing. So I don't know if that explains my thinking. I'm trying to address these complexities in a good way, as I think that when we stand in solidarity with one another, we need to explore what that solidarity looks like with each kind of like marginalized community, as there's going to be a different set of conditions. There's going to be a different way we are affected by colonization that needs to be addressed. And my video, I feel like I wasn't clear in my video last time, but no way am I trying to say that all Black Americans are like this. It's only like a small portion of the community that I've been seeing, but I've been seeing it slowly grow over time, and I've been seeing more debate lives like it. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring up this conversation in a good way. And I'm not perfect. I'm gonna mess up, and I don't expect that everyone can read my mind and understand my full thinking. So I like to make response videos like this. Typically, I like to talk in person with people, so that if anything is misconstrued, I'm able, or misunderstood, I'm able to address it right then and there. Also, my video was in no way talking about those Black Americans that do have Indigenous parents, or those that are officially claimed by a tribe, or those who have descended from the Caribbean. So I feel like standing in solidarity with each other is going to look different depending on what needs to be addressed right now in the moment. And then we can work on the next step and the next step. And hopefully things can change in a good way. And I do my best to come across as respectful, as my people, when we would make treaties with other tribes, the first portion of the treaty making process was to ensure that respect was conveyed heavily. Respect was heavily encouraged. Respect was one of the most important things my people would do when we would conduct the treaty process with another tribe. Because when we address the people that live amongst us, we need to make sure that we're coming at it from a good way. And which is why we would have tobacco and the pipe during our treaty making process to kind of convey that respect. But each tribe is different. Each tribe had their own treaty making processes. This is just kind of one example out of a multitude. So I do my best to come across as respectful. These situations are complex, and standing in solidarity with each other is going to look different. So I hope that addressed everything. But yeah, I would love to get your thoughts and your opinions. And if there's anything you'd like to discuss, feel free to make your own video response or let me know in the comments.
This is all, excuse me. This is all I got from this video. It's a very long one, you know. I took my time to I saw this video, and I was like, okay, I need to understand what she meant by settlers. And also, I do not want to only focus on the settlers, but there is also something that I've learned over time talking about Black history or talking about my people, is that when people say something about Black people, do not try to make words or try to understand the words or whatever they said on their behalf, right? Like the way she said that, I hope you can read my mind. No, I cannot read your mind. I don't read people. I am not a mind reader. I don't know what you have in mind or what I am trying to understand. But what I am going to understand from what you said are the things that came out from your mind, right? Now, I personally feel like calling Black people settlers, I mean, you cannot call Black people in America settlers. If there are people that are settlers, we can talk about the Europeans. They are the ones that are settlers, right? And Black people did not wake up and just they were kidnapped. Do you know what it means to kidnap people? Black people were kidnapped, right? So to the best of my knowledge, Black people were not settlers, They were kidnapped, sold, and then they got into America, United States of America, right? And they made their own very beautiful, unique ethnicity in America. So if you ask me also, I am going to say that they are also Americans, right? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like other people need to come together as one. But then when you look at the people that you are calling to come together, you find that the majority of them actually do not care about Black people. So majority of times I just swallow what I have to say, And also they should actually understand that Black people are not a monolith. This is something they should get into their school. So what am I saying? I think saying settlers, using settlers for Black people really, I feel like, I don't know if she understood what she was saying by calling Black people settlers and by using that word. And I hope she apologizes, she comes to apologize for using that word. And one thing with these people is that when they see the settlers, they will not say anything. But the ones that are not settlers, they will call them settlers and then come back to tell you, oh, it was whatever it is. But I hope she retract that word, because that is not a right word, the right word to use for people that look like me. And I think that is it. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there are some words I want to say. There are some words I'm also trying not to say, right? Because I already do not want anybody fighting in my comment section. Yeah. I do not want some people fighting in the comment section. And also, I think it's also time for Black people to understand that people will absolutely have opinion. But I think people will always come up to have opinion about black people, but then what opinion do you have about black people? It's only when it comes to people that look like me that everybody got opinion. People have one thing or another to say about black people, when black people will never come out. Like, I don't know, but I think everybody's in black business. You know, everybody wants to talk about black people. Everybody wants to have something. We always have something to say about black people. But one thing I'm going to say is that black people are not and will never be settlers. You know, if she's going to make a sweeping generalization, like, you know, like she just did with that settler thing, she said the very least you could do is, you know, use appropriate language. She did not use the right language, and I don't know why she used that settler, you know. And if she has something more to say, I think you should direct those false claims of indigenous identity right back at white people, because, like, you know, they are the ones I have never, I don't know, they are the ones that I've never seen with papers trying to collect benefit, you know, talking about, like, you know, 1% or chopped up, but whatever it is. One thing I'm going to say is that it's everybody could just get something to say about black people. I am really trying to be very careful with what I say, because there is a particular group of people that I do not want them to be in the comment section, like, you know, fighting. Yeah, so for that reason, I try as much as I can to limit some certain things that I say, and I hope you absolutely understand it. And one more time, black people are not settlers. Don't use that word, and retract the word. You don't go to somebody's place, took them away from their homeland, brought them to where they started a different life altogether, different thing altogether. And like, you know, man, sometimes I remember, like, how did they do all this? How did they perfected all their plans, like, you know, coming to Africa, took people away, took them back to build them up. Because everything my people did was to build them. My people built them. And somebody wants to call my people settlers. Bye for now.